It's kind of funny that you can possibly have all the logical reasons in the world to stick with what you know. But as soon as someone sees that Apple logo on a chassis that looks like a piece of art, the sensible choice of a device from a competitor just doesn't stand a chance. For years, we've been told that if you wanted this level of refinement, this specific feeling of solidity and intention, you had to pay the Apple tax. You had to buy into the top of the pyramid, to a point whereby the machine like the one right here shouldn't even exist. It's a device that fundamentally breaks the rules Apple has spent a decade perfecting. The Neo's biggest surprise comes even before you turn it on. The moment you pick it up, you realize Apple hasn't really compromised on the first few things you'd notice. True to form, the entire chassis is carved out of anodized aluminium, and at around 1.23 kilograms, it has the same reassuring sense of heft we've come to expect from the rest of the MacBook lineup. But more importantly, it doesn't feel like an entry-level machine. If anything, it's the sort of first impression that immediately makes you wonder where Apple did choose to compromise. The display doesn't really answer that question either. It's a 13-inch liquid retina panel, gets up to 500 nits of brightness, which is comfortably on the brighter end for a laptop, and the resolution is exactly what you'd expect from Apple. Text is razor sharp, and it's perfectly comfortable to use during the day. The only place you really notice a compromise is color, as Apple has kept it to the sRGB color space, which means it's the kind of limitation that only really shows itself in more demanding creative workflows. The speakers are well positioned, they're mounted along the sides of the chassis, so when it's sitting on your lap, the sound isn't being fired straight into your legs. Instead, it wraps around the laptop, staying remarkably clear and full in a situation where a lot of laptops begin to sound noticeably more muffled. Now, do they have the same low-end presence as the Air or the Pro? No. But I also don't think that's the comparison to make. Judged on their own, these speakers are remarkably well balanced. The hinge is exactly what it should be, smooth enough to open with one hand, yet stiff enough to hold its position wherever you leave it. The keyboard is one of those things you start noticing almost immediately, and I mean that as a compliment. It uses the same scissor switches as the rest of the MacBook lineup. It feels fast, predictable, and reliable. If I had to nitpick, I'd probably ask for just a little more key travel during longer writing sessions. But beyond that, I really don't have much to complain about. There is one design decision that still confuses me, and that's the notch. Luckily not on the screen this time around, but that little indentation on the bottom lip that's meant to make one-handed opening easier. It's kind of weird that Apple rounds off just about every other edge on this thing, yet somehow leaves this one sharp enough to double as a letter opener. The trackpad is where Apple starts doing the little things differently. You see, traditional trackpads are physically hinged, which means the click changes depending on where you press. The further you move away from the bottom edge, the softer and less tactile that click becomes. Apple has completely re-engineered the internal mechanism, so the click feels almost identical across the entire surface. Now, if you're coming from Windows, you might be wondering why that's worth talking about. Well, it mostly comes down to habit. Most Mac users still physically click the trackpad, as tap-to-click is a functionality that's disabled by default on macOS. So having a click feel this consistent, no matter where your finger lands, ends up making a much bigger difference than you'd expect. And once you've experienced it, every conventional trackpad suddenly feels like it was designed around a compromise. The ports are one of the reminders that every design still involves trade-offs. You get two USB-C ports, one running at USB 3 speeds and the other limited to USB 2. Since they both charge the laptop with the same wattage, I'd reserve the faster port for drives and external accessories and let the slower handle the power cable. Then there's the inclusion of the headphone jack, giving a legacy port to the general public, while the pro users who actually need that low latency connection for high-end audio gear, leading them to be tethered to docks and adapters, is a move only Apple can pull off, especially if you consider the fact that they've nearly spent a better part of the last decade persuading the average consumer to abandon this very connection in favor of AirPods. Alright, let's talk performance. The Neo is powered by the A18 Pro chip. As this was originally designed for the iPhone 16 Pro, the limitations on storage, RAM and ports suddenly start to make a whole lot more sense. But before we dive deeper, let's set this straight. Who is the Neo actually designed for? I've tried editing images from my recent trip in Lightroom while having a ton of browser tabs opened on Zen alongside working on this very script in Notion. But you know who the Neo is actually designed for? Look, reading through the discussions online, it feels like a lot of the conversation surrounding the Neo is missing the point. It's really easy for us reviewers, when analyzing a new device, to default to stress testing it against the exact same yardstick we use for everything else. We throw heavy workloads at every laptop that comes our way, watch it hit a spec ceiling, and treat it like a major flaw. These discussions eventually get heavily bogged down in memory limits, thermal pad mods, older refurbished alternatives, and talks on what happens when you push the hardware into lanes it was never built to drive in. And that kind of misses the bigger picture here. As you've seen, over the past few months, I've tried throwing the kitchen sink at this laptop, and it just runs. Now, just because it can run different pieces of software doesn't mean it was designed to run them. More often than not, running those apps would probably lead you to hit the 8 gig memory limit before maximizing anything else. That said, looking at those extreme tests objectively, the real value in tracking those limits is that it shows us exactly what the headroom is like. Think of those creative or coding related tools as an added bonus to what this laptop already has on offer. And it is when you look at it from that perspective, you realize that if your Grow workflow consists of spreadsheets, Canva presentations, and document editing, especially with the endurance numbers looking like these, the Neo isn't just enough, it's technically overkill in the best way possible for years to come. Speaking of which, repairability is another area where Apple has quietly changed direction with the Neo. It's still far from perfect, but compared to previous MacBooks, this feels like a genuinely meaningful step in the right direction. Getting inside is fairly straightforward. The entire bottom panel comes off with 8 pentalobe screws, and once you're in, the changes become fairly obvious. Apple has gone back to a more mechanical and screw-based architecture, making components like the battery and I/O ports modular. This means they can finally be replaced individually instead of turning relatively simple repairs into far more expensive logic board replacements. That shift doesn't extend quite to the display though. While the internal connectors are certainly more accessible, the panel itself remains part of a fused assembly, so if the screen gets damaged, you're still replacing the entire lid rather than just the display. The biggest limitation though is also the one thing Apple hasn't changed. Unified memory is still integrated directly into the silicon, so whatever config you buy on day one is the config the laptop will have for the rest of its life. Now, what you may also notice is the lack of fans here. Apple instead relies on a small air gap inside the laptop, and since air is naturally a poor conductor of heat, that gap acts as an effective insulator, helping keep the warmer internal components separated from the bottom casing. The end result is a laptop that stays remarkably comfortable to use on your lap, all while remaining completely silent. So finally, what makes the Neo tick? Well, it's the resolution of a long-standing tension in laptop design, a category defined almost entirely by its compromises. On one end of the spectrum, you have the utilitarian budget Windows laptops and Chromebooks, respectable enough in raw specs perhaps, but fundamentally lacking in elegance and endurance. On the opposite end, you find the premium ultra portables, machines with exquisite builds and remarkable longevity, but carrying price tags that demand a significant thinness tax. You'll notice I'm not citing performance as a primary differentiator here. That's because, despite the industry's insistence on pushing these featherweight machines, the value proposition often falls flat. If a user truly demands power in a compact frame, especially on the Windows side of things, they'll inevitably seek out a dedicated GPU, at which point the dream of owning a thin and light laptop evaporates into the reality of heat and bulk. For the average person, the idea of spending $1,500 to $2,500 on a slim chassis while leaving substantial performance on the table is a trade-off that simply fails to resonate. It's paying more for essentially what is less of a system in a lot of ways. Funnily enough, the last time we saw a genuine play in this segment from a big-name brand was from none other than Microsoft, with the release of the Surface Laptop Go back in 2020. For a device that launched over half a decade ago, its DNA is strikingly similar to the Neo. As you can clearly see, I still use mine to this day, and it's the very same machine that got me through my 3 years at college, and is still my go-to for script writing and travel. Now, some may say the Laptop Go was perhaps ahead of its time, but it proved that well-designed laptops didn't have to be expensive. If it hadn't eventually fallen victim to the ceiling of its own hardware and its $700 launch price for the 128GB storage variant, it would have probably held its relevance to this day. Apple's trajectory over the past few years, by contrast, hasn't been random. It's been a methodical pursuit of the consumer through the lens of specialized hardware. We saw this first with the Silicon-era MacBook Pros, which were unapologetically aimed at the creative elite, reclaiming the power and raw thermal headroom that professionals demand. Then came the redesigned Air, which pushed the boundaries of what a prosumer ultra-portable could be, offering a level of polish and sustained power that previously required a much larger investment. Both machines were statements of intent, as they were aspirational tools designed to capture the top of the pyramid. With the top of the market now secured, the Neo represents Apple's definitive move toward the center. It is the bridge across that traditional divide, a machine designed to offer a cohesive experience without the usual concessions. And while we've seen recent ambitious attempts to challenge this dominance with Snapdragon-powered laptops, these alternatives often feel like a work in progress, navigating the hurdles of a developing ecosystem alongside the lingering friction of app compatibility. And to be honest, when the interface you interact with on a regular basis feels less like an operating system and more like a platform for AI experiments and Copilot integration, the entire experience begins to fall short. Laptop manufacturers are often caught in the middle here. They can strive for the perfect assembly, meticulous designs, brilliant displays, and cutting-edge silicon from Intel, AMD, or Qualcomm, but when that hardware has to fight against an unoptimized or cluttered software environment like Windows, the brand reputation pays the price. There's a persistent friction in the Windows ecosystem, whether it's the update loops, the jarring driver flashes, a search function with one job it seemingly refuses to do, offering you a Bing web result for a file that is sitting quite literally 3 inches away on your desktop, or the whirring of a jet engine under your palms while the BIOS tries to reinvent itself, are some things we've simply learned to accept as the cost of doing business. This is exactly where Apple's absolute control over their hardware and software pipeline becomes their greatest weapon. They essentially have free rein to capitalize on this segment. Because keep in mind, they aren't just selling you a device, they're selling you an escape from that very friction. And that's ultimately what macOS feels like. Coming from Windows, what surprised me most wasn't any one feature. It was how cohesive everything felt. The animations, the interface, even the logic behind where things live all seem to follow the same set of rules. Nothing feels like it was bolted on years later or inherited from a completely different era. Features like Spotlight and Quick Look are a good example of that. Neither of them are particularly revolutionary on their own. Windows has alternatives, and Linux users have had similar functionality for years. The difference is that on a Mac, they're simply part of the experience. You don't spend your first afternoons searching for replacements, tweaking settings, or downloading third-party utilities just to make the operating system feel complete. And that's always been one of the biggest differences for me. Windows gives you options, Linux gives you control. macOS, by comparison, feels far more opinionated, but in a way that benefits the average person. Instead of asking you how you'd like things to work, it simply assumes you'd rather they just did. And once you've spent enough time with the Neo, you start to realize the philosophy extends well beyond the operating system. It's easy to look at a laptop through the lens of specifications, but after spending some time with the MacBook Neo, I don't think that's where its strengths really lie. They lie in the hundreds of little engineering decisions that most people will never notice individually, but almost everyone would appreciate collectively. You're no longer buying the cheapest MacBook, you're buying a laptop that delivers the parts of the Mac experience people actually notice, while asking remarkably little in return. With the Neo, Apple isn't just lowering the price, they're elevating the standard of what an entry-level machine is allowed to be.
Rising demand for artificial intelligence and data centers is now hitting consumers where it hurts, their wallets.
As big tech companies race to build massive data centers to power the growing world of AI,
they're prioritizing these large orders for these data centers?
Exactly, because the monetary pressure to do that, they're just, quite frankly, paying more.
Now, tech giant Apple has raised the price of MacBooks and iPads by around 20%, citing a semiconductor shortage.
That's because the prices for memory and storage chips, which are inside virtually every computing device, have suddenly skyrocketed. It's so bad that Tim Cook is calling it a 100-year flood.